Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In this lesson, we'll be analyzing the short story, The Tower by Marghanita Laski. Okay, so an italicized guidebook entry, it details a curving road that leads to a tower in the Italian countryside. At the junction, the left branch takes the traveler to Florence, and the right one would lead the tourist to the Tower of Sacrifice, which was built in 1535 by Niccolo di Ferraman and containing 470 steps. In 1549, the surrounding village was destroyed, leaving only the tower intact. The guidebook suggests the structure is an object of superstitious fear. Reading this entry on her first solitary road trip, Caroline feels a triumphant sense of independence. So, beginning with the guidebook entry, it highlights the tower as the story's eventual destination. The details of the tower's history immediately lend a sense of eeriness to the atmosphere, even as Caroline's high spirited state of mind contradicts that feel. As a result, this opening begins to slowly build tension between Caroline and her surroundings. The themes which are being portrayed over here are fear, psychological torment, and uncertainty, and intuition and self preservation. What do these themes actually entail within them? The details of this would be shared at the end of the list. So Caroline has had a very successful afternoon. For the first time ever, she has taken the car out on her own for not just a drive but for a cultural excursion. The guidebook belongs to her husband Neville, who often recommends it to her. Not a native speaker of Italian, Caroline has struggled through the translation and managed on this trip to visit four frescoes, yani ke four paintings, two campaniles, which are known as bell towers, and an obscure wooden crucifix in an out of the way village church. She is particularly proud of this last discovery as she thinks it is unlikely that Neville would know about the crucifix, meaning she will have something new and unique to contribute to his constantly accumulating hoard of culture, storage of culture. So Caroline's moment of triumphant independence is rooted in her desire to impress her husband with the cultural landmarks she has seen. By constantly offering her the guidebook, Neville has pressured Caroline into taking this trip. Though her pride is apparent, it is obvious that Neville's opinion significantly affects Caroline, dictating her actions to the point that she has spent her entire day alone doing the things he likes. Art and culture are thus introduced in the story in terms of their significance to Neveloni. So the theme over here would be patriarchy, control, and freedom, which is self-explanatory over here through Neville, who's the husband of this lady, Caroline. And another theme which happens to be very clear over here is art, culture, and pretense. Okay, so moving on. Caroline is tempted to stop and add the tower mentioned in the guidebook to today's collection of cultural sites. There is enough time and daylight left to see it before heading back to her and Neville's flat in Florence. Rereading the guidebook's entry, the name of Niccolo di Ferramano calls to mind a portrait of a white faced man with dark eyes. The remembered image confuses Caroline only for a moment before she recalls where she has seen this man before. Caroline's rationalization of a last minute visit to the tower displays her ambition and desire to prove herself. She is a woman capable of experiencing things on her own, and she wants Neville to know it. The portrait of Niccolo di Ferramano it dents Caroline's initiative by tinting the scene with subtle, ominous foreboding. The themes happen to be patriarchy, control, and freedom, and intuition, and self-preservation. Okay, so in a flashback taking place 3 months prior, Just after Neville and Caroline were married, he brings her to live with him in Florence. Neville himself has already lived there for 2 years and is eager to show off his knowledge of Tuscan culture to his new wife. Tuscan is a place in Italy. Though Caroline would have been content seeing one or two of the more prominent galleries before preoccupying herself with the fashion shops closer to home, Neville meets these plans with contempt. यानी कि Caroline is more encouraged and more interested in shopping and things related to fashion, which is seen with contempt with Neville through in the eyes of Neville. He insists that she, as the wife of a British Council member, should start by visiting more obscure privately owned galleries as she is no ordinary tourist. She's no ordinary tourist. She's the wife of a member of the British Council. So Neville brings Caroline to live with him as if she were a piece of luggage, and it is subtly hinting at his possessiveness. His work lets him enjoy certain privileges, and he not only takes full advantage but views other methods of cultural engagement with contempt. Again, the sense is that he accumulates cultural knowledge in order to elevate his own status. Though he is intelligent, this portion of the story characterizes Neville as pretentious and controlling. Again, it is self-explanatory. The theme would be patriarchy, control, and freedom, and art, culture, and pretense. Now, hoping to please Neville, Caroline accompanies him to several castles and private homes, a privilege afforded to him by his status on the British Council. In these homes, she gazes upon a multitude of refined art pieces unseen by the general public. It is in one such castle that she sees the man with black eyes. Remember, we are going on a flashback. This is the flashback. So, in these one of the castles, she actually saw this man with black eyes. Upon arriving at the castle, the housekeeper leads Neville and Caroline into a gallery which is lined with family portraits. Accustomed to her role, but at this point completely anesthetized to Italian art, Caroline dutifully allows Neville through the gallery, listening to him go on and on about historical and artistic intricacies until a painting across the room catches her eye. Now, Caroline is accurately aware that her social duties as Neville's wife require her to take interest in his work. Despite her pride in Neville's social standing, she has become indifferent to art, a fact to which Neville is oblivious. The dynamics of their marriage feel performative and in Neville's case, inconsiderate. Yani ke in the dynamics of the marriage of this couple, Caroline has to perform the duty and Neville is completely inconsiderate to her whims and wishes. So Caroline is always hoping to make Neville happy, while he never notices how bored she is by his lectures. This imbalance in the relationship owes itself to the patriarchal society that prioritizes men at the expense of women. Again, it is self explanatory that the themes would be patriarchy, control, and freedom, and art, culture, and pretense. Okay, so Caroline asks Neville about the subject of the painting, who is a young girl. He is pleased that she picked this portrait out, as it is thought to be the prize of the collection, speaking to Caroline's good taste. The portrait has been painted in light blues and greens. The young girl sporting honey gold hair. Her name printed beneath is Giovanna di Ferramano, and she died in 1549. Remember the age? Remember the year? In the present, now coming back to the present, Caroline realizes this is the same year the village near the tower was destroyed. In the flashback, she remarks to Neville with shock that the girl died at age 13. Neville responds that girls married young in those days. Okay, So Neville and Caroline react to Giovanna's portrait very differently. Neville appreciates its aesthetics and worth as a piece of art, while Caroline considers the person it depicts and her tragic early demise. Here again, Neville approaches art for self interested reasons rather than appreciating the humanity it depicts. The coincidence of Giovanna dying in the same year the village was destroyed increases the ominous atmosphere building around the tower. Neville's spontaneous comment about girls marrying young is coldly dismissive and betrays what little value he assigns to women's lives. The theme would be patriarchy, control and freedom, art, culture and impotence, and fear, psychological torment, and uncertainty, which is seen in the portrait of Giovanna and which is going to be transformed from Giovanna into Caroline. So Caroline is even more surprised to learn that Giovanna was married, as she is noticeably young and radiantly virginal in the portrait. Neville points out the portrait beside Giovanna's. Neville points out the portrait beside Giovanna's and asks Caroline what she thinks of it. Here she encounters the pale young man with black eyes for the first time. His hand rests upon a pile of books in the portrait. Rather than a name, the inscription beneath it reads Portrait of an Unknown Gentleman. Despite this, Neville identifies the man as Niccolo di Fermano, Giovanna's husband. Acha ji. So Giovanna and Niccolo di Fermano come into focus as a parallel for Caroline and Neville's marriage. The story relies heavily on implication here, as not much is known about either the tower's architect or his wife. But the lack of detail serves to increase the building tension. Giovanna, married and dead so young, is a tragic figure, while Nicola's dark eyes are unsettling, implying some unknown threat. The themes happen to be fear, psychological torment, and uncertainty, which is pretty much clear over here, and intuition and self preservation. Okay, moving on further. Neville tells Caroline that no one in the family will mention Niccolo by name because of some scandal. On Neville's last visit to this gallery, he mistakenly asked the Count, the nobleman of that castle, about Giovanna and her husband. The man's reaction let Neville know that this was a sore subject. He did not mention Niccolo at all, and of Giovanna only said that either she was lost or she was damned. So Neville cannot remember which one did he actually say, whether she was lost or she was damned. But he speculates that Niccolo dabbled in black magic because of the books in his portrait. Disturbed, Caroline turns back to the picture of Giovanna, and Neville remarks that Caroline herself looks a bit like the woman in the portrait. Interesting. Nicolo's potential involvement with the mysterious solidifies the menacing aura surrounding the tower. The old count's reluctance to speak definitively on Giovanna's death suggests something gruesome, something ugly. And when taken in the context of Niccolo's scandal, it implies whatever happened to her was his fault. Whose fault? It was Niccolo's fault. To whatever happened to his wife, Giovanna. Okay, so in a way, it is implying that Giovanna's death was actually the fault of Niccolo. It is only an implication. So Neville's inability to remember whether Giovanna was lost or damned again displays his dismissive attitude towards women. His remark comparing Caroline to Giovanna not only suggests he views his own wife in the same way, more than more like an object than a person, but it also aligns Caroline's fate with Giovanna's as she makes her visit to Tower. Remember this. The themes happen to be fear, psychological torment and uncertainty, intuition and self preservation. patriarchy, control and freedom, art, culture, and pretense. Okay, so back in the present, Caroline decides she has enough time to go look at the tower and drives toward it, stopping at the fort that leads back to Florence. An urgent voice inside her suddenly insists that she wants to go home to Florence where it is safe. Disturbed, Caroline still gets out of the car and proceeds to the tower, rationalizing her actions by thinking how silly it would be to miss the chance to see something she is interested in. By this point, the sun is setting and she hurries onward. Returning to the present with the tower's ill omened backstory in mind, the voice in Caroline's head urging her homeward reads as very reasonable and even rather intuitive. This is the first appearance of the voice, and it is also the only time in the story that this voice is clearly focused on Caroline's self preservation. By ignoring this voice, Caroline betrays her own well being in favor of chasing her husband's approval, symbolized by the phallic tower she sets out to conquer. The theme happens to be fear, psychological torment, and uncertainty, intuition and self preservation, patriarchy, control, and freedom. Now, standing in front of the tower, Caroline knows that it is made of red bricks with narrow openings in the facade leading up to the top, where a platform extends around the exterior. She enters the tower and takes in the bare interior, empty, aside from the staircase that clings to the wall, spiraling upward towards the low ceiling. Thinking she will go up and admire the view, Caroline begins to climb the steps, counting them as she goes. Coming through the ceiling of the lower level, she sees that the rest of the tower's shaft is open. The staircase spirals up towards a circle of evening sky with no inner wall for protection, only a rusty rail. So the physical description of the tower amplifies the reader's feeling of discomfort as Caroline heads inside. Bare of ornamentation, it is not ornamented or decorated in any way. It has no obvious purpose, and even the act of climbing is immediately shown to be risky. The space is so claustrophobic that Caroline's thought to climb to the top and see the view feels painfully naive, as if she too can sense the wrongness of the tower, but is trying to override the intuition telling her to leave. The themes would be fear, psychological torment, and uncertainty, and intuition and self-preservation. Continuing to climb, Caroline notes that the slits in the brick are placed too high for anyone walking on the staircase to see through them. Above, she can see that the sky is quickly darkening. Momentarily, she thinks that the more sensible thing to do right now would be to go home. And yet, she keeps climbing. Halfway up, she discovers breaks in the rusty railing that come more and more frequently, and some of the railing even crumbles away in her hand. Caroline presses herself against the brick wall and continues upward. So, of the tower, the senselessness of the tower's architecture, it becomes clearer with each step, and the encroaching darkness closes around both Caroline and the reader, amplifying the sense of isolation. Caroline's internal disagreement shows that her thoughts and actions are increasingly at odds, her mind insisting on returning home while her body keeps climbing the unstable stairway. This psychological torment, paired with her dangerous surroundings, adds another layers to the feelings of dread. Again, the theme would be fear, psychological torment, and uncertainty, and intuition and self preservation. Nearing the end of her journey, Caroline grows more internally conflicted, arguing with herself that she ought to go down, but also that it would be silly to give up at this point. Another separate part of her brain continues to count the steps, finally reaching 407. The top of the tower is still 20 feet above her head, and Caroline remarks aloud that the whole thing's absolutely pointless before discovering a door in the wall beside her that leads out onto the platform she saw from the ground. The platform encircling the tower is narrow and slopes downward away from the tower. Mentally, Caroline becomes more fractured, continuing to argue with herself while yet another part of her brain is counting the steps. Her remark that the tower is pointless highlights some of the dread that has been mounting. The dread returns almost immediately as the reader, so close to Caroline's perspective, steps out with her onto the narrow, sloping ledge. The themes again happen to be fear, psychological torment, uncertainty, intuition, self preservation, patriarchy, control, and freedom. Now, looking beyond the platform, Caroline sees how high up she is. It strikes her as impossible that she could be so high. And she is suddenly overcome by the impulse to throw herself off the tower, saying, I cannot go down any other way. Alarmed by this persistent thought, Caroline closes her eyes to ward off the dizziness and steps back through the doorway into the tower. For the first time, she looks down into the shaft of the tower and the precarious staircase she will have to traverse in order to leave, and she screams, I can't go down. So the voice in Caroline's head seems to shift from trying to protect her to encouraging her, from trying to protect her to encouraging her to jump to her death. Though it is never made clear who or what the voice belongs to, it is possible to read it as the voice of the tower manipulating Caroline to make herself a willing sacrifice. Caroline's rationality struggles to maintain control as this voice and the fear it incites push her closer to hysteria. Perhaps the story here is alluding to sinister patriarchal methods of maintaining control by pushing women to distrust their own perceptions of reality. It is also possible that the voice represents the strange and gloomy human tendency to indulge catastrophic thoughts. The themes are the same as the previous. For a long while, Caroline is unable to move from the top step, watching as the light fades into darkness. She is fully unable to fathom climbing down the stairs in the dark. The voice in her head saying that it would be much easier to fall. She cries for a while, debating the reality of the situation before steeling herself and beginning her halting descent. Caroline makes it two steps before she is again struck dumb with terror, unprotected from the murderous voice in her head. She sits down and slides down several more steps, pressing as close to the interior wall as she can. Though the story's horror has reached a peak, it is almost entirely internal. Caroline's self inflicted immobility, inspired by the tower's height and possibly its sinister whisperings, represent how difficult it is for women to escape patriarchal influence. At this point, she cannot tell whether the voice in her head belongs to her or the tower. And the horror of being unable to trust one's own mind recalls the way her own desires have been blended with them. The themes happen to be fear, psychological torment, and uncertainty, and patriarchy, control, and freedom, which are self explanatory at this moment. Moving on, trying to stand again at the 21st step from the top, Caroline is once again unable to move. Something brushes her face, and though Caroline knows it is a bat and not a hand, this horrible touch finally spurs her down the rest of the stairs, counting all the way, her hand dragging the brick wall and tearing her skin to shreds. She can hear more bats around her and thinks that if one of them touches her again, she must fall. Unthinking, Caroline comes down the tower in the dark, her brain automatically counting the steps until she reaches 500 and beyond. The tower is inescapable. Rather than conquering it and proving her independence, Caroline is trapped within its walls, the same way she has been trapped within Neville's influence for her entire trip. Caroline's story ends as her psychological torment manifests itself in the physical world as the seemingly unending staircase leading her down into the dark. By refusing to explain the extra trays, remember they were 470 and she had counted 500. So, by refusing to explain the extra trays, the story forces the reader to inhabit the same unsettling uncertainty as Caroline, extending the horror beyond the page. The theme happened to be fear, psychological torment, uncertainty, which she is going through, and patriarchy, control, and freedom, which might be the reason behind her situation. Okay, now over here we will share details, discuss details of all the four themes which have been discussed over here, which have been pointed out. Patriarchy, control, and freedom happens to be the first theme. So the tower, it paints a disturbing picture of the difficulties women face asserting their independence in a patriarchal world. Caroline lives under the stifling influence of her husband Neville, a member of the British Council who constantly pressures her to accumulate cultural knowledge and experience. Although Caroline desires independence in the context of her marriage, she also wants to impress Neville, and she sets out on a solo trip to visit various cultural sites around Florence. Encouraged by the freedom she feels driving alone, Caroline decides to visit and climb the Tower of Sacrifice. Significantly, even as Caroline asserts her own will by climbing the tower, she is still chasing Neville's approval and allowing his values to dictate her action. So the tower's architect, Niccolo di Fermano, and his young wife Giovanna provide a parallel to Neville and Caroline's relationship. Giovanna's early death and Niccolo's alleged dabbling in the black magic implied that the young woman was a direct casualty of bad male behavior. Sharpening this point, Caroline's reaction to Giovanna's portrait clashes with Neville's. Caroline is shocked by how young Giovanna was at the time of her death, while her husband says only that the portrait is thought to be the best thing in the collection. This careless dismissal, combined with Neville's later remark that Caroline and Giovanna are quite alike, hints that Neville views his wife as just another fine object in his collection rather than a human being with interests of her own. Ultimately, Caroline finds the tower itself a phallic symbol of male dominance to be inescapable. The way it is impossible to escape male dominance, it is impossible to escape the tower. So, tower becomes the symbol of male dominance. Having climbed its fearful height of 470 steps, Caroline is met with two options: either hurl herself from the top or climb down into darkness. Overriding the sudden impulse to jump, Caroline climbs down the tower only to find that this choice also leads to peril. In the end, Caroline is trapped in the tower in the same way she is trapped in her marriage and subjected to the limitations of her husband's patriarchal influence, which incidentally caused her to climb the tower in the first place. In this way, the story highlights how impossible it feels for women to transcend male influence in a patriarchal society in which every choice results in oppression. The second theme is fear, psychological torment, and uncertainty. The Tower is a masterwork of suspense, claustrophobia, and horror. Initially, this atmosphere makes itself known through subtle signs. The guidebook's ominous historical context on the tower, Niccolo di Fermano's potential dealings with the occult, and Giovanna's possible damnation. It comes as no surprise that the tower itself is a worthless, claustrophobic place with only a dangerous staircase leading to the top. And yet, despite this ideal setting for a haunting tale, most of the story's horror actually comes from Caroline's internal psychological trauma. Out on a solitary day trip, Caroline's isolation provides fertile ground for the psychological torment she experiences within the tower's walls. Alone at the top of the tower, a voice in Caroline's head tells her to jump. There is a sense that this is the tower's sinister method of achieving its sacrifice. It masquerades as one's own voice of reason. Caroline manages to override the voice's suggestion, but her fear repeatedly paralyzes her as she climbs down the stairs. Inching forward in fits and starts, the reader's perspective narrows to occupy the same claustrophobic space as Caroline as she haltingly descends. Even when a bat frightens Caroline into movement, there is no relief from the building tread. And then, in a subtle but very disturbing way, the story ends with Caroline counting the 504th step, even though readers know there should only be 470 steps. The terror in her head has seemingly made its way into a physical reality. No reason is given for the existence of these steps, whether Caroline miscounted or died or is trapped in some sort of purgatorial space is left up to the reader's speculation. By leaving Caroline's fate ambiguous, Lasky forces readers to inhibit the same liminal space. The same liminal space, the uncertain transition between where you have been and where you are going physically, emotionally, or metaphorically, happens to be the liminal space. So Lasky forces readers to inhibit the uncertain transition between where you have been and where you're going physically, emotionally, or metaphorically. So, as her character, Lasky forces readers to inhabit the same liminal space as her character, fully immersing them in a tormenting and frightening sense of uncertainty. The next theme happens to be intuition and self preservation. Because of its ambiguity, The Tower is a story that relies heavily on implication and the reader's intuition. The details of the tower's history are critical, but very thin, and they are not entirely reliable. Neville infers that the tower was built and Niccolo di Fermano dabbled in the occult, leading his family to disown him. Niccolo's young wife Giovanna died in the same year the village that once surrounded the tower was completely destroyed. Apart from these tantalizing details, the tower's actual backstory is never explicitly revealed, leaving the reader to formulate their own hypothesis about what dark things might have happened there. In this way, the story keeps the reader on the same footing as its protagonist, Caroline, who knows all the same information when she goes to visit the tower. Caroline's own intuition makes an appearance just before she enters the tower as an urgent voice inside her that tells her to return to Florence. Like the reader, Caroline has guessed based on the limited known details that the tower's history is unpleasant and that it might be even dangerous. Caroline disregards this intuitive form of self protection and enters the tower. The next time such a voice makes itself known, its aim seems to have shifted from protecting Caroline to convincing her to throw herself from the tower's, perhaps suggesting that it can be dangerous to rely on intuitive forms of self preservation. One interpretation reads this shift as the voice of the tower intruding on Caroline's thoughts to manipulate her into becoming a willing sacrifice. Another way of reading this takes the story's ending into account. When Caroline seems to perpetually descend the tower stage. Knowing this, it is possible to read the voice as Caroline's intuition, attempting to save her from whatever unseen horror awaits at the bottom of the stage, if that is, she ever finds the bottom. In this reading, her intuition would effectively suggest that death is better than whatever her fate is now that she has entered the tower. The story intentionally leaves the question of who controls the voice, the Tower of Caroline, ambiguous emphasizing the horror of being unable to trust one's own mind. The last theme happens to be art, culture, and pretense. Art and culture play a central role in the tower. Neville is a member of the British Council, an organization dedicated to the exchange of cultural ideas, and is himself an avid collector of cultural knowledge and experience. But Neville's interest in art is primarily a means to elevate his own sense of self importance. He never misses an opportunity to show off his discoveries. He is contemptuous of Caroline's desire to visit public galleries and lectures endlessly on the works in privately owned collections. By characterizing Neville as pretentious and self absorbed, the story calls the purpose of scholarly art into question. Neville and Caroline's encounter with the portraits of Niccolo and Giovanni di Fermano further presses on the issue of art's value or purpose. Caroline is struck by Giovanna's youth and the tragedy of her death, and she declares that she does not like Niccolo. Her reaction to the portraits is personal. Neville, on the other hand, values the paintings based on their aesthetic and academic significance, noting that Giovanna's portrait is generally thought to be the best thing in the collection, and that Niccolo is intriguing because of the unspoken scandal surrounding it. The juxtaposition of Neville's and Caroline's reactions demonstrates the way some people, rather than sincerely engaging with a piece of art, view it as a means to elevate their own state. Despite her appreciation of Giovanna's portrait, Caroline visits the tower in the hopes of elevating her own standing in Neville's eyes. She approaches the tower as something to be possessed and added to her collection, as the only remaining structure of a destroyed village. The tower is implied to be both survivor and cause of the disaster. Here, the story acknowledges the durability of art but also suggests there is a cost, that pursuing status and power inevitably leads to casualties, like the village and Juvan. Similarly, Caroline sacrifices her own well being for the sake of impressing Neville, entering the tower with impure, superficial motives. In this way, the story illustrates how engaging with art as a means of achieving status and power can ultimately harm instead of enrich people. The last but not the least happens to be the symbol, which is the tower. So the story's tower represents the inescapable nature of patriarchal society and the psychological torment it inflicts on them. The tower's vague connection to black magic and the death of the builder's wife implicitly associate the structure with the kind of harm that befalls women in patriarchal societies. Nevertheless, Caroline sets out to conquer the tower and the male dominance it symbolizes. Having climbed the tower, she can add it to her own collection of cultural experiences in order to impress her husband, Neville. It does not occur to her at this point that Neville's opinion is still foremost in her thought and dictating her actions, thereby weakening her independence. Reaching the top of the staircase, which seems to lead nowhere, Caroline initially remarks, "But how idiotic! The whole thing's absolutely pointless." Like the patriarchy, the tower exists for no explicit purpose other than its own glorification. An inner voice, possibly belonging to the sinister structure, urges her to jump from the top of the staircase. The horror of being unable to trust one's own thoughts is itself a recognizable experience for women living in a world where men are presumed to know best, as when Neville dismisses Caroline's cultural interests and forces his own upon her. Driven to panic by the unsettling voice and the precarious darkness that surrounds her, Caroline descends the tower only to find that she is trapped within its throne. In the same way, Caroline is trapped under her husband's influence, which drove her to visit the tower in the first place. Through the tower, Lasky highlights uh, the tendencies of patriarchal society, the mental toll it takes on women, and the difficulty of speaking or of escaping its influence. With this, we happen to end this lesson. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask.